The chair lays out on second reading HB 2071. The clerk will read the bill.
HB 2071 by Jetton, relating to certain public facilities used to provide affordable housing.
The chair recognizes Mr. Jetton to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, House Bill 2071 adds guardrails to an existing economic development tool that provides workforce housing for essential individuals like teachers, nurses, and law enforcement. The bill stops abuses of the program by tightening up the standards to use the program, requiring transparency and increasing accountability while keeping tool flexible enough to be used around the state. The bill requires local governments to sign off on this tool, ensures Texans hold their elected officials accountable for how the tool is used. I want to thank the many members and the stakeholders that have helped to draft this bill and ensure that it will end the abuses while preserving the tool for local governments that desperately need and to solve real and immediate workforce housing needs. I have an amendment.
Okay. Mr. Gates, for what purpose?
Can I ask the author some questions?
Would the gentleman yield for questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, what does your bill see as the problem is with PFCs?
The bill looks at PFCs as an economic development tool to provide workforce housing at the discretion of elected bodies that get to meet those needs.
But what is the problem that you see with PFCs?
Right now,
that your bill is trying to correct?
There's not enough accountability and transparency, and that's what this bill seeks to address.
Has there been, would you consider, has there been an abuse in using the PFCs?
Arguably, have been abuses, especially when I look at the Houston Housing Authority and a lot of the cases that have happened in Harris County.
And what is some of those abuses that your bill is trying to correct?
Ensuring that when apartments are taken off the tax rolls, that they're done with providing sufficient affordable housing to offset those.
Okay, so when you say affordable, when they use the PFCs, they get their taxes wiped out. Is that right?
That's correct.
And how long are their taxes wiped out?
For as long as the PFC agreement is in place.
And those are usually 75 to 99 years?
However long the PFC agreement lasts.
Typically, is that 75 to 99 years?
The amendment that we will be adding onto here will require a minimum of 10 years.
A minimum? What's the maximum?
There's not a maximum on it.
So it could be, can it be further than 99 years?
As long as the elected local body determines that's what is needed, yes.
Okay, currently it's 99 years, and you're saying your bill is going to let it go even longer than 99?
It's going to create a minimum of 10 years.
And what is the maximum?
There is not a maximum.
Okay, and to get this 100% tax abatement that there is no maximum, it can go more than 99 years, what do they have to give up to get that?
There's different criteria for acquisitions and new developments for a percentage of that to go towards workforce housing levels, so 60% AMI, 60 and 80% AMI.
But if he's able to lease at that, and he's not, and can he do it and not actually lose any money? What if the project is already at that level?
I'm not aware of any apartments that are already at 60% AMI, and if they were already at 60% AMI, I'm not sure why an elected body would remove that property from the tax rolls to supply what is already being supplied.
Okay, the way the structure is right now is not part of the problem is that developers are getting this 100% tax write-off, and you can't see what the public benefit is?
I think that is why we're trying to provide transparency so that whenever something is pulled off the tax rolls, that there is evidence of actual workforce housing made available. If it's not made available, then the governing body that approved it is held accountable for that. And being held accountable for that, I don't believe that they will leave those off the tax roll when they're not providing benefit to the area that they're intending to.
Should there be some minimum, for every dollar of the tax benefit the developer gets, shouldn't there be some guaranteed minimum that's going to go to a public benefit?
There's sufficient guardrails in the bill that we've put together to ensure that at least a minimum of workforce housing is made available through the PFC. The governing bodies have the ability to provide deeper affordability if they desire. Because each deal is different, I don't think that you can go through and say that this is as much or this is a solid what the return on investment is going to be for any of these deals.
But isn't the problem that there, in some of these, a lot of these deals, you mentioned Houston, there is no benefit that can be determined. Is there a minimum guarantee that your bill says has to go to a public benefit?
There's a percentage that have to go towards 60% AMI and a percentage that has to go towards 80% AMI.
I understand that. But what if that doesn't result in any reduction of the tenant's rent? What if all those rents are already market rent?
Then the governing body that approved that PFC would remove the PFC exemption and add them back to the tax roll. The point of the accountability that's on this bill is that there's an annual audit, and the exemption only exists so much as long as they are meeting the agreement with the city for the workforce housing percentages.
So we're depending. Is there a minimum that you'll agree to in your bill that needs to go to a public benefit? Here's what I see happening. You mentioned Houston. The developer's getting 100% tax write-off, but some of these deals, the developer's keeping 90% of that money. Only 10% is going to actual reduction of rents. Do you understand that?
I understand that, and that is why we were put in place accountability and transparency, so that if there's abuse of the PFC system, that there's governing bodies, your city or county, that is going to be held accountable for those PFCs that are.
Okay, so your bill doesn't have any minimum amount to guarantee that it's going to go, that there has to be a public benefit.
The bill has guardrails in regards to the percentage of units that have to go towards 60% AMI and 80% AMI.
And how does your bill deal with the auditor? Do they get to pick a self-audit, or is it going to be an independent, like the state does the audit?
It'll be a third party. They can elect a third-party auditor.
Who picks that auditor?
That would be determined between the PFC, and local governments can weigh into it. But we're talking about auditors that have licensing and certifications that they're not going to put at jeopardy for an audit. I would also add that we have a conflict of interest portion that is being added to this bill with an amendment as well.
So it sounds like your bill allows the developer to pick the auditor.
They could pick the auditor.
Okay. You don't see a problem in the developer being able to pick their own auditor?
I would have a serious issue if a certified auditor, someone was willing to risk their license to forge PFC documents for a unit to be able to take that exemption.
Does your audit, do they have to determine that there's actually a benefit to the public? That means that they're actually, does the audit show how much the developer is giving in reduced rents and how much is going in his pocket?
The audit is intended to show how many units go towards 60%, 80%, or whatever was agreed upon between the PFC and the unit and the governing body.
Okay, so if they meet that term and it winds up there's no public benefit, the developer gets to keep 100% of the tax write-off and no public benefit.
If there is no public benefit, the governing bodies that approve these tax exemptions would no longer keep those exemptions in place.
But Mr. John, we already know that's happening. We already know. That's why
there's a lack of transparency around PFCs right now. This bill intends to ensure that there is transparency so that there can be an accountability.
So when you say transparency, is the audit going to show whether there is actually any public benefit?
It is going to show how many units are at 60% AMI, 80% AMI, or whatever's agreed to between the PFC and the governing body.
I got that. But what if that is market rents? And if it is market rents at those different income levels you said, and there is no public benefit, is the audit going to show that?
Yes, the audit will show that, and therefore there can be accountability, and the governing bodies that realize that they're not providing a public benefit will remove those PFC exemptions.
So, okay. Typically, okay, so how much do you see is going, a typical deal, if the developer is getting a million, the average is $1 million tax write-off, how much do you see that the developer is keeping in his pocket, and how much is going to rent reduction?
I think that every deal, every apartment, and you know this, every apartment has a different market rate that they're operating at, different operating expenses that they operate at, and so having a one-size-fits-all, this is the criteria, does not work, and this is why we have designed this program. This is beyond me. This is not me creating this economic development tool. This is an economic development tool that already exists, to ensure that there is a tool for local governments to be able to provide workforce housing. We want to make sure that there's sufficient guardrails and accountability. And that's the goal of this bill.
Okay, so the audit doesn't show that the developer is actually losing money. Your bill doesn't say that there has to be a minimum proven in a public benefit. All you have to do is just meet and make sure you meet these. You rent a certain number of units at certain income levels.
That is correct. The agreement made between the PFC and the local governments is what the PFC should be operating at.
Okay, for a new development, the biggest need is for families, 3 bedrooms, and for 2 bedrooms. Does your bill say that you got to have a certain minimum of 3 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms?
I do not believe that there is a need in all 254 counties, all the different cities, to have 3-bedroom apartment requirements. I can tell you that the bill does ensure that there's proportionality in the workforce housing that's made available. So out of those 60% AMI units, it has to be even proportionally distributed between efficiencies, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, or whatever is offered at that apartment.
Okay, so your bill doesn't address 2 bedrooms. It doesn't address 3 bedrooms. And so in your bill, a developer could build all efficiencies in 1 bedrooms.
If they work out if the agreement between the PFC and the local government that is elected by the constituents determines that their area needs efficiencies, 1 bedrooms, and that's it, then I think this is an economic development tool that they can use where there's still proportionality in those workforce at those 60% AMI rates between both the 1 bedroom and the efficiencies.
So your bill seems, it doesn't set any minimums. It just depends on the goodness of the developer and whoever does the deal, the city or the housing authority.
The intent of the bill is to make sure there's sufficient guardrails.
Okay.
And so we want to make sure that there's flexibility regardless of where they operate in the state to meet the needs of that specific area. When we move everything to elected bodies making these decisions, they are representing a constituency that will now be able to see with their own eyes to determine whether or not there's 60% AMI, 80% AMI, 50% AMI, whatever that local body says needs to be provided, that those homes, those apartments are being made available to the workforce in their area. And if they're not, then there can be accountability for those individuals.
Okay. Let me go to some other questions. A typical, let's say it's $1 million write-off or taxes that have been wiped out. Would you agree that half of that is for school taxes?
Likely, yes.
Okay. When the school taxes are wiped out, who makes that up?
It's either going to be other property taxpayers or it's going to be the state.
Say again?
Either other property taxpayers or the state of Texas.
Okay, the state of Texas, under the Robin Hood plan, the state would have to make up that difference, wouldn't they?
In some cases, yes.
Or they just raise the taxes on everyone else?
That's how property taxes works. When valuation is pulled off, then it is, and the tax revenue stays the same, then it's pulled from other sources, other valuations.
Okay. So there's going to have to be a tax increase then.
There's a potential for property tax increase for other individuals. The state of Texas, if the state of Texas picks it up, then it comes out of our general revenue.
Okay, if you wipe out $1 million in local property taxes, the city loses it, the county loses it, and the school loses it. Who makes it up? You're saying there may not be a tax increase?
My argument is that if a local governing body determines that this is a value to their area to use this economic development tool, then that governing body is going to be held accountable by the people of that area. And this is an economic development tool that we want to have available in all areas of the state.
Okay. They can go to a housing authority and do this deal, can't they?
They could not.
Could they go to a municipal district and do the deal?
If it is made up of a elected body, yes.
Okay. So if you go to a municipal district and do the deal, and that's a very low part of the tax pie, would you agree?
Actually, I take that back. That is not accurate. The amendment that we're adding on there is only going to allow a municipality to approve a PFC, and if they are in an unincorporated area, then a county would be able to approve it. And those are the only two that can approve a PFC.
Okay, inside a city, can a management district approve a deal?
No, sir.
Okay, if it's in the city can approve the deal.
Yes, sir.
Okay, now you give notice to the county, right?
Yes, sir.
Can they deny and say this? We don't think this is a good deal. Can they unilaterally? Do they have the option to approve the deal or not?
They could not.
They don't.
They could not stop it.
They can't stop it.
It would be it would have to be approved during a public hearing where they could voice their concerns with it, and also because it's during a public hearing, the constituency they can raise a concern about it.
They can express their concern, but they can't stop it. The school district,
to the extent that if they are going against the will of the people, they won't be reelected.
The school district, they're going to get notice, but they don't have the right to stop the deal, do they?
That's correct.
Even if it's a bad deal, they can't stop it.
If it's a bad deal, then there's going to be accountability for those elected officials that approve that deal.
Well,
through an election.
Right. And so let's say we have the county can't approve it, the school district doesn't get to approve it, but the city gets to approve it. Now, can they work a deal with the developer and say, hey, if we're going to lose this taxes, we want you to pay us a fee that compensates us for the taxes we're losing? Can they do that on your bill?
Where's pilot? Yes.
I'm going to do it.
So if for a payment in lieu of taxes to exist, the governing body would have to approve it, which would be counterproductive for them.
Now, if they go to the city and do the deal, can they offer the city a payment in lieu of the taxes they are going to lose? So that can they do that under your bill?
In theory, but if they're removing it from the tax rolls, I don't understand what the payment in lieu of taxes would resolve. The whole point of the PFC program is to remove the property tax burden.
And right there, Mr. Jetton, you just hit on one of the key abuses in this program. Virtually every deal that's been done in the city of Houston and Dallas they make sure that they get a payment in lieu of their taxes, and everyone else loses all their taxes. Did you know that?
So Mr. Gates, if I'm not mistaken,
The gentleman's time has expired.
May I have an extension of time, Speaker?
Members, you've heard the motion. Is there objection? The chair hears none, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker,
Ms. Thompson, for what purpose?
parliamentary inquiry.
Please state your inquiry.
Can we bring spring down and let summer rest, the winter rest for a while? It's cold in here.
Ms. Thompson, I believe that's a question for Chairman Metcalf.
all right.
Mr. Gates, you may proceed.
Okay. I would like to continue on with what we're talking about with payment in lieu of taxes, because when you talk about that abuse, we're talking about the Houston Housing Authority taking property off the tax rolls and accepting payment in lieu of taxes to the Housing Authority. We are moving this to where only elected bodies get to determine this. And so the advantage of taking property taxes off to accept payment in lieu of taxes it doesn't make sense. It made sense whenever the Housing Authority was the one that was taking off the property tax rolls. We're removing that.
Okay, and Mr. John, I appreciate what you're trying to accomplish in your bill, because I think we have the same goal. We're trying to bring some accountability to this whole thing. If you think it's wrong to do the payment in lieu of taxes, would you be okay with an amendment to prevent anyone doing a payment in lieu of taxes? Would you be okay with that?
I would consider amendment. And I just want to add that this bill has been worked on by many stakeholders over many months. And an attempt has been made to make sure that we are addressing this need, this PFC tool, from all the different angles. And at the end of the day, all of our stakeholders, none of them are happy with the end result, in the sense that everybody's giving some. When we talk about the big overarching philosophical thing that I wanted to make sure was on this bill was the elected boards being the only ones able to implement PFCs. The whole idea is to put in guardrails and put in transparency so that there can be accountability, so that this economic development tool makes sense in all areas of the state. I would be willing to look at an amendment dealing with pilot. It has not been brought up as a suggestion as of yet.
Well, I believe if we could do an amendment to eliminate the payment in lieu of taxes, that would go a long ways to bringing reform. Because that way, someone getting a payment in lieu of their taxes wouldn't be benefit for their own self-interest. They would have skin in the game. You say the audit. Wouldn't you think it would be better to maybe have the state is going to have to make up for all these school property taxes that are wiped out? Wouldn't it be better to have an independent, a truly independent Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs do the audit? Wouldn't that make better sense to let the state do the audit themselves and be truly independent?
I think that we have qualified CPAs in the state of Texas that have certifications and licensing attached to their auditing, that I think it would be unreasonable to assume that they would commit fraud to protect a PFC. And if they did, I think there's a proper accountability around the licensing for any auditors. I don't think I don't agree necessarily with requiring another state agency to have to audit what will eventually go to appraisal district for storing and review what we can do with private auditors today.
I see it like if you go get a loan at a bank on your home, the bank isn't going to let you bring your own appraisal from a licensed appraiser. They're going to want to pick that appraiser themselves. It's not really that anyone is doing something dishonest. It's, in this case, I would think the state would feel better if it was doing the audit and it had control of who is doing the audit.
So
and why would you be resistant to that?
I think there is a difference between an appraisal where there is subjective biases that goes into it versus a financial audit that is a report of numbers in your books.
But why would you be resistant with the state doing the audit?
I don't believe we need another government entity to audit what we have private sector CPAs to handle.
Well, that's what their job is. The Texas Department of Housing, that's who audits all the tax credit deals from the department. This wouldn't be a big load on them because we could charge a fee, because I'm sure whoever is going to do the audit is going to charge a fee. Just let the state do the audit. And that way it's truly independent. Would you be open to that?
This would once again fall into the category of things that among the stakeholders discussions that we've had, this is not a discussion that has been brought up. I'm willing to consider an amendment on this to address this. At the end of the day, again, we have CPAs that are licensed and capable of doing financial audits, that there's accountability process already in place for those auditors if they decide to cook the books or commit fraud. And so I think that I don't believe that we need to add more government into the auditing process for what CPAs can already accomplish.
But you're open to an amendment to having the state do the audit.
My general feeling throughout this entire process has been to have an open door and to make sure that we put together a bill that considers everyone's thoughts and ideas. And everybody's been invited to that table. My door remains open to the extent that we can make this bill better. I have not been approached by anyone, including you, about an amendment or specific language dealing with this audit.
Okay. And isn't the stakeholders that you're referring to, aren't they the ones that are doing the PFC deals right now?
Some of them are. And not all, they're mostly, nobody is coming out of this genuinely happy with everything that's in this bill. Everybody is hurting a little, which is how I know and I feel comfortable that we're putting together a bill that properly addresses and puts proper guardrails around this economic development tool.
What about putting a time limit on these tax? Instead of 99 years, you said there's a minimum of 10 years?
Minimum of 10 years, yes. If someone is going to take advantage of property taxes being removed from the property tax rolls, there should be some long-term plan to it. If after that 10 years, at any point, the city, county that approved the PFC deal determines that it's not necessary anymore, it can be dissolved at that point.
And so why not let's limit it to maybe 15 years? Say a minimum of 10, a maximum of 15. Why? I mean, 99, that's longer than any of us are going to be alive in 99 years, and our kids are going to be alive virtually. Why 99 years? Why not let's put a limit of 15 or 20 years on this?
I think primarily because elected officials will be the ones that approve or deny this. An elected official can turn this down and shut off this PFC at any point that they feel that it is not providing a benefit to their community anymore.
Okay, here's part of the reason. We're here today because we know there's abuses in the system. And with the deals that have been done now, we are stuck for 99 years. So why not put a time limit of 15 or 20 just in case we're not making the right decisions today?
I'm sorry. Please repeat. Please repeat your question.
Huh?
Please repeat your question.
We know we're here today because there's been abuses in the system. You agree with that?
That is correct.
Okay. But we are stuck with those right now for 99 years. we don't know if we're making the right decisions today. So why not put a time frame of 15 or 20 years from today that it expires in case we don't have it right now?
The biggest piece of the puzzle that's missing right now is the transparency component. When they're
The gentleman's time has expired.
I already did that.
The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Jetton.
The chair recognizes Mr. Jetton to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment adds in a land use rider agreement, adds conflict of interest language, clarifies the audit report submission process, updates the affordability requirements, exempts certain conservation districts, including additional language regarding vouchers, updates the effective date, and removes the unnecessary cure reference. I move passage, or move adoption.
Mr. Gates, for what purpose?
Yeah, can I ask the author some questions on the amendment?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Yes.
The gentleman yields for questions.
Okay, could you, I'm having trouble understanding this amendment. Can you explain it?
The amendment adds in language for land use rider agreements.
Members, please take your conversations outside the rail.
Adds conflict of interest language, clarifies the audit report submission process, updates the affordability requirements, exempts certain conservation districts, includes additional language regarding vouchers, updates the effective date, and removes unnecessary cure reference.
Well, I'm not understanding that. Can you explain that in a little bit layman's terms?
Mr. Gates, the amendment should be on your screen.
Well, it's a 4-page amendment. That's the full description of it.
Fortunately, I posted the amendment hours ago for everyone to be able to review.
Okay, I have some amendments.
Move adoption.
Mr. Jetton sends up an amendment. The amendment is acceptable to the author. Is there objection to the adoption of the amendment? The chair hears none, and the amendment is adopted. Mr. Tinderholt, for what purpose?
I raise a point of order against further consideration of this bill according to Rule 4, Section 32C2 on the grounds the bill analysis is misleading.
Please bring your point of order down front. The point of order is withdrawn. Mr. Tenderholt, for what purpose?
Respectfully request the dialogue between Representative Gates and Jetton for the duration of this entire bill be reduced to writing and placed in the journal.
Members, you've heard the motion. Is there objection? The chair hears none, so ordered. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Gates.
The chair recognizes Mr. Gates to explain the amendment.
What this amendment does, one of the problems in doing these PFCs is this was created, it wasn't even created by the legislature. It was created by a floor amendment in 2015, 9 days before the end of the session, and everyone thought the amendment applied only to for-profit entities. In fact, there was a discussion on the Senate side between Senator Estes and Senator Segler when the amendment came up, and the question was asked, Senator, does this apply only if they continue in the nonprofit status? The answer is, sorry, I didn't hear you. The question, does it apply only in a nonprofit status? And the answer was, what you're saying is the government entities would be nonprofits, not profits. And the answer was yes. And that was accepted amendment. That has turned into, in 2016, the first 2 PFC deals were done. By 2020, there was 30 of them done. In the last 3 years, there's been 225 PFCs done across the state of Texas, wiped out over $10 billion in assessed values. This is hurting our schools. This is hurting our counties and our cities. This is being taken from our fire departments, our police departments, our neighborhood schools. They are getting their taxes wiped out, and we can't determine if there's any public benefit. And what this amendment does is it establishes a floor of at least 60% of the tax benefit has to go to lower rents. There has to be a verifiable by an audit that at least 60% of that tax savings is going to lower rents. Because you can't, what the abuse is, and one of the reasons we're here is because what's happening is in the vast majority of these deals, only less than 10% is actually going to, some of these deals have 0%. 100% of the money is going to developers' pockets. In fact, members, I own apartment complexes. I own 44 apartment complexes in Houston, Texas, and the surrounding area. Under this bill, the way it's written, 42 of my properties qualify, and I would not have to reduce the rent 1 penny. And I could get all of my taxes, property taxes, wiped out for 99 years. That is what is the lack of guardrails on this system. So what this says, regardless of what you do at 80%, 60% income level, at the end of the day, there has to be at least 60% of the tax savings has to go into lower rents. That's all this bill does. I
Ms.
feel
Howard,
like it
for
should
what
be
purpose?
higher, but at least 60% I think is a good compromise.
Mr.
Developer
Speaker?
can keep
Ms. Howard, for what
40%.
purpose?
Would the gentleman yield for some questions?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Thank you. Representative Gates, one of the things I have some questions, but I want to ask you this one first. So what you are saying is that these local government entities have the authority to exempt their own tax base to subsidize these apartment developments, but they also have the authority apparently to exempt the tax base of other taxing authorities. Is that correct? Without their approval?
That is right. And with this payment in lieu of taxes, what a developer does is go to, say, the city and say, hey, we will reimburse you for your taxes if you do this deal. And if that becomes binding, and the school district gets no say-so, the county gets no say-so. So
Exactly.
How do they pay for their police or the sheriff department?
And I believe, is it not correct that with other economic development incentive programs that we've had in the state, that the approval of the taxing authority that it will be losing its tax revenue has a say in whether or not to approve that? Is that not correct? Like with what we were dealing with 313s and that sort of thing, where the school board's got to make a decision about whether or not that particular loss of revenue was going to be okay with them, since they were losing some of their tax base.
Well, under this bill, the school has no say-so.
Well, without the amendment that you've just presented, does HB 2071 contain any mechanism that would ensure that a certain share of the tax benefit received by developers would go toward reducing rents for tenants in income-restricted units?
No, there's no guarantee. It's just based, that's right. And that's what this amendment does. It sets the minimum of at least 60% of the tax savings has to go to reduced rents.
Does HB 2071 contain any mechanism that would ensure that any of the tax benefit received by developers would go toward reducing rents for tenants in income-restricted units?
There's no guarantee under this bill.
So without the amendment before us, there's no guarantee that any of the tax savings received by these developers is actually going toward the public benefit of reducing rents in these income-restricted units. Is that correct?
That is correct. And the other thing about this amendment, is there's going to be an audit that goes with this amendment to determine and verify that that's actually happening.
So without this amendment, if a developer can figure out a way to produce the required units only using, say, 25% of the tax benefit to do so, they can hold on to the remaining 75%. Is that correct?
That's right. And right now, under the bill, we don't even know if they're keeping more than 75%. That's right.
The developer could figure out a way to produce the units required by only using 5% of the tax benefit and holding on to the remaining 95%. Is that correct?
That's what, that is right. That's what's being shown by investigative reporters that have gone and looked at some of these deals, is that sometimes they can't find any public benefit.
So let me just make sure here. Your amendment does not kill the PFCs, does it?
Absolutely not. I think this can be a valuable tool if it's used in the right way.
And so what does this actually look like on the ground? Do we know how much of the 100% tax break developers are actually using to reduce rents?
Right now, we have no way of knowing, and even under this bill 2071, even with the audit, it doesn't audit to see if there's actually a benefit. It just makes sure that you're leasing to people at certain income levels, but that may not be resulting in any reduced rents.
So what your amendment is doing is trying to put some kind of accountability guardrails around this so that we know that we're getting benefit to affordable housing from these tax breaks. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Tinderholt, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for
Will
questions?
the gentleman yield for questions?
Yes.
The gentleman
Thank you.
yields.
So really, in, I'll call it Army terms, the guy across the street that has low-income apartment complex gets some percentage of their taxes reduced, and they show savings to the residents in the apartments. Is that semi-accurate? Not in PFCs. I'm talking about in most low-income apartment complexes.
In what kind of complex?
Just low income, where they HUD housing, where they get, you know, the ones that we have to sign for them to build in our area. They get reduced taxes. Is that correct? Well, they do, and let me explain. So the guy across the street gets some level of reduced taxes, but PFCs pay no taxes. Is that correct?
That's correct. This is a 100% wipeout of all the taxes for 75 to 99 years.
So who gets to make up the difference for that 100% that they don't have to pay for? Let's say they buy a apartment complex with 500 units. Since they're not paying taxes, who makes up the difference? Because the city needs a certain amount of money to operate. Who gets to pay for that?
That's why I believe the way this bill is written, it's going to be a tax increase, because everyone else is going to have to pay an increase in taxes.
Right. So you and I and our constituents, when PFCs exist and come into town, and they don't do anything for the residents in those complexes, they're pocketing the money. The people that own that apartment complex, they pocket the money, while taxpayers, our constituents, have to pay the difference to make sure that fire and police and those things operate. Is that semi-accurate?
And our schools, that is correct.
Schools. And so what your amendment does is forces them to take 60% of that to put it back into the complex and help the people that live in that complex with decreased rent.
That is correct. It has to be verified that it's actually decreasing the rents.
Thank you for answering my questions.
You're welcome.
The gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes Mr. Jetton in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I ask that you vote against this amendment. The provisions that we put inside this bill create guardrails and accountability and transparency so that there can be accountability of your local elected officials that approve PFCs. People are able to tell what workforce housing is made available in their community and determine whether or not that meets their goals. And so I'd ask for you to vote against this amendment. Thank you.
The chair recognizes Mr. Gates to close on the amendment.
Yeah, I think what has been shown in the abuses in this system is the fact, look, this PFC model it can be a good tool if it's used properly. It was never really intended for, like I said, for for-profit apartment owners. But if we decide to continue on with this, let's ensure that there is a minimum amount that's going to the tenants into actually reducing their rent. This is going to allow, if you say 60% is the goal, then the city and the developer can negotiate and decide, are we going to do 3 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms? Are we going to do it at people that really need it? You know, those that are looking for at the 50% AMI level, the 60%. You know, what's so frustrating, and you look at these, do you know that in the state of Texas, virtually no apartment complexes now are being done with 3-bedroom apartments and 2-bedroom apartments? Nothing's being for families. And so this bill is going to ensure that with 60% going to lowering rents, there will be a motivation to make sure maybe some 3 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms for families at the lower AMI levels. I ask you to vote for this.
Mr. De Ayala, for what purpose?
Gentleman yield for questions.
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Yes.
The gentleman
Just a
yields for questions.
clarification point, Mr. Representative. The current bill 2071 does have reduction, that is increased affordability than what's in the current statute, correct? It's simple. Just, I mean, the 2071 increases the affordability requirements in PFCs from the current statute, correct?
No, see, there's the problem. I think what you're referring to is it says you got at least some at 80% of AMI, right? 40%, and it's going to say 10% at 60% of AMI, right? Okay. If the market rent is already lower than that, then you are not creating any affordability. And that's the problem. We're not creating affordability if the market rents are already at that level.
And
To make affordability...
I understand what you're saying. The point I'm trying to get at is this. The current, at least from the metrics of AMI, it is more affordable than the current statute, correct?
Well, I look at affordability as, is there going to be a benefit where it makes that apartment more affordable for a tenant? If they walk up and at those levels that you say, the market rent's already there, you have an increased affordability. It's already there.
I appreciate your hypothetical. Let me move on real quick. With this amendment, you create a standard that is a one-size-fits-all for every community around the state, regardless of what their needs are for workforce housing or more affordable housing or what it is. This amendment sets a one-size-fits-all, not just where you and I are from, closer to Harris County, but across the state. Am I reading that correctly?
No, actually, it does the opposite, because if the goal is 60% has to go to lower rents, then in a high-income area, you wouldn't do as many units. In a area, say, where the lower AMI is lower, well, then you may be able to do more than 50% of the units. This gives the maximum flexibility, because now if everyone says, okay, the objective is to have at least 60% has to go to lower rents, you can now create whatever deal you want.
Representative Gates, if I may, when you create that requirement at 60% of the tax value that's being given, you create, this is where you need to get to regardless of affordability. Am I saying that correctly?
Well, are you, okay, and under this bill at 60%, it means the developer keeps 40%. Are you saying the developer should be able to keep more than 40%?
That's not the question I asked you. The question I asked is how it relates to affordability. It's a number. It doesn't meet and give a community in West Texas or East Texas or somewhere else the flexibility for workforce housing if that's really the void that they need, if that's the gap that they need. It doesn't do that, does it? It doesn't give them that flexibility, does it?
Yes, it does, because when you say 80% of the lower medium income, there's going to be areas where the area median income is much, much lower, or the tenants are much lower. regardless of where you go in the state of Texas and do a PFC deal,
Right.
you just have to structure it where at least 60% goes to lower rents.
Two things I think we can agree on is, number one, there are significant abuses in the current PFC law, right?
That is right.
Okay. And this bill, 2071, does a lot to take care of transparency, does it not?
No.
Okay. Does a lot to take care of accountability, right?
I don't understand how you think it does accountability.
I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay.
Ms. Gervin Hawkins, for what purpose?
Mr. Gates, I want to ask you a couple questions on this bill.
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Yes.
The gentleman yields for questions on the amendment.
Mr. Gates, is the PFC a good program? Is the PFC an effective, good program to promote low-income housing?
Not for, under its current structure, it's not, the PFC for a for-profit developer is not working the way it should in providing lower income housing.
So what you're saying, it'll be more effective with nonprofit developers?
Under the section that this is being put together in, that's what this amendment applies to, the 60% of the tax savings.
So what you want to do is tell the developer to put 60% of the annual tax expense into reducing the rents. Is that what your bill is trying to accomplish?
Well, he's going to, yes, he gets 100% tax write-off, exemption. He needs to put back 60% into lower rents.
So let's do some simple math, Representative Gates. Simple math. There's a project that costs $100,000. You've got all the other expenses to maintain it. And the tax line item on there is $15,000. But because you don't have to pay that $15,000, you can reduce the rents that you're collecting from your tenants. Is that correct?
Under the bill, the way it's currently structured, you're not bound to have to give any of that $15,000 back into lower rents.
But when you run the numbers, your net income, because taxes is an expense line item, when you run your numbers, the advantage is that you have less expenses, correct? So
Okay,
in essence, the tax revenue is going into lowering the rents.
No, you have your income here, and here's your expenses. You lower by $15,000 here, and there's nothing in 2071 that says you got to reduce anything on the income side.
No, but what does say that is your debt service. So your debt service determines how much you can pay back to the lender. So in essence, because you're not paying the property taxes, you can pay more in debt service, which allows you to give you a higher quality of a project and also have some cash flow.
Well, now what happens is it's kind of like if you own your home and you got two homes, they're each worth $100,000 apiece, using your example, and all of a sudden you wipe out the taxes on one that doesn't have to pay taxes for 99 years. Well, someone's going to be willing to pay more for that house if they don't have to pay taxes for 99 years if they get to keep all that tax savings. So yes, you will increase the value, and that's the problem. People are rushing into the state of Texas to do these deals because what happens is you reduce the taxes, and so now you have a greater net operating income, which increases the value as long as the developer gets to keep that tax benefit. And that's the problem. And so what this bill is saying, hey, you're going to have to give some of that back so that the rent comes down.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Can the gentleman, will it extend at least for a couple minutes?
Members, you've heard the motion. Is there objection? Vote aye, vote no, division vote. This is on the motion to extend the gentleman's time. Strike the board. The motion fails. The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. A record vote has been requested by Mr. Slayton. A record vote is granted. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Cortez voting no. Show Mr. Goldman voting aye. Show Mr. Jetton voting no. Mr. Guerra voting no. Have all voted? Have all voted? Show Ms. Johnson of Harris voting aye. There being 81 ayes, 60 nays, the amendment is adopted. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Gates.
Chair recognizes Mr. Gates to explain the amendment.
Is when you have the city, the county, and the school district are the ones that are going to lose their taxes. What this amendment does is it says because they're going to have their taxes at risk, they get a say-so to make sure the deal is a good deal. So it's just got to get the approval of all three taxing authorities, the city, the county, and the school.
The chair recognizes Mr. Jetton in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Speaker. Members, I'm asking you to vote no on this amendment. The amendment is already made with proper guardrails in there for elected officials who approve these PFCs to be held accountable. I ask for you, please vote against this amendment.
Mr. Gates. The chair recognizes Mr. Gates to close on the amendment.
Okay. I move for adoption.
The question occurs on the adoption of the amendment. A record vote has been requested. A record vote is granted. The clerk will ring the bell. Show Mr. Jetton voting nay. Show Mr. Cortez voting nay. Show Ms. Rose voting nay. Show Mr. Metcalf voting nay. Have all voted? Have all voted? There being 83 ayes, 56 nays, the amendment is adopted.
The following amendment, the clerk read the amendment.
Amendment by Slayton.
The chair recognizes Mr. Slayton to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, this is just a simple amendment to the bill that would bring some transparency, similar to Sarbanes-Oxley, where you can only keep an auditor for 3 years and you have to change. It's going to make it in place here where they can't keep an auditor for 3 years and they would have to change, and this is acceptable to the author. I move adoption.
Mr. Slayton sent an amendment. The amendment is acceptable to the author. The objection to the adoption of the amendment, the chair has done. The amendment is adopted. Any member speak for, against, or on the bill? Hearing none, the chair recognizes Mr. Jetton to close on the bill. Mr. Slayton, for a purpose.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make a motion to reduce to writing the dialogue or the conversation between Representative Tenderholt and Representative Gates.
On HB 2071?
Yes, sir.
Members heard the motion. The objecting chair hears none, so ordered. Mr. Gates, for what purpose? The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Gates.
The chair recognizes Mr. Gates to explain the amendment.
Proves accountability and transparency acceptable to the author.
Mr. Gates sends up an amendment. The amendment is acceptable to the author. The objection to the adoption of the amendment. The chair has done. The amendment is adopted. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
The next one we're doing. Amendment by Gates.
The chair recognizes Mr. Gates to explain the amendment.
This proves accountability and transparency, and it's acceptable to the author.
Mr. Gates sends up an amendment. The amendment is acceptable to the author. The objection to the adoption of the amendment. The chair has done. The amendment is adopted. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Gates.
The chair recognizes Mr. Gates to explain the amendment.
This just proves lowering the area median income of the person at a lower level and improves accountability.
Mr. Gates sends up an amendment.
Acceptable.
The amendment is acceptable to the author. The objection to the adoption of the amendment. The chair has done. The amendment is adopted. The following amendment, the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment by Gates.
The chair recognizes Mr. Gates to explain the amendment.
And this also just it provides for an audit and to bring accountability and transparency. It's acceptable to the author.
Mr. Gates sends up an amendment. The amendment is acceptable to the author. The objection to the adoption of the amendment. The chair has done. The amendment is adopted. The chair, any member wish to speak for or against on the bill? Seeing none, the chair recognizes Mr. Jetton to close on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For everyone's sake, I move passage.
The question occurs when passing engrossment HB 2071. A record vote has been requested. The clerk will ring the bill. Mr. Gates voting aye. Mr. Schaefer voting aye. Mr. John voting aye. Mr. Cortez voting aye. Mr. Hefner voting aye. Have all members voted? All members voted. There have been 138 ayes and 4 nays. HB 2071 is passed in engrossment.